June 12, 1944. A hedgerow lane south of Isigny, Normandy. Morning haze clings low, sweet with cut grass and cordite. The first burst is not American. It rips from a concealed German MG42, high, metallic, almost a saw, stitching the bank and tearing leaves into dust. The reply from the American side is different. A measured clack from an M1919A4 set low on a tripod. 5, maybe 6 rounds. Silence. Another short pulse. The assistant gunner feeds the belt with gloved hands. The gunner breathes, counts, corrects. Heat rolls from the barrel, but it does not glow. The tripod settles. The traverse and elevation mechanism nudges half a degree. The lane ahead is a shallow, beaten zone. The crew has mapped by eye and habit. Across the hedgerow, the German gun barks again. Long, hungry streams that sound fast, even when you cannot see the muzzle. Then a pause, a hurried barrel change. Voices muffled by earth and brush. The American gun speaks in spare, staccato sentences, conserving brass, keeping the lane closed. The difference is not strength. It is a method. It is the discipline of short bursts, learned, drilled, and paid for over years of study and weeks of war, which is where our story begins. Before the hedgerows, before the lanes, there were manuals, schools, and an American idea of how a machine gun should live through a long day. In the interwar years, and on the eve of World War II, U.S. infantry doctrine treated the machine gun as a sustaining instrument, not a thunderclap. The Browning M1919A4, air-cooled, belt-fed, 30.06, was bred for endurance when handled with care. Set on a sturdy M2 tripod with a traverse and elevation, T&E mechanism, it was expected to speak in controlled phrases, not breathless monologues. The theory put geometry ahead of drama. Gunners learned to shape a beaten zone, that shallow ellipse of danger where rounds struck in predictable patterns across distance. If the gun could keep that zone alive for hours rather than minutes, the platoon would own the ground. Rates of fire on paper came in 2 languages. The cyclic rate, what the mechanism could spit when held to the trigger, and the practical rate, which leaders actually wanted. The first impressed. The second won battles and preserved barrels. American training stressed fire discipline, short bursts to manage heat, conserve ammunition, and keep dispersion tight. The assistant gunner was not just a loader but a metronome, counting in the head, watching mirage and muzzle rise, tapping the gunner's shoulder when the cadence slipped. Ammunition carriers stacked belts in protected recesses, kept covers closed against dust, and rationed boxes as if they were hours of daylight. Across the lines, the Germans had built a different center of gravity. The MG34 and later the MG42, with their high cyclic rates and quick-change barrels, put shock at the heart of the squad. German infantry formations were constructed around the gun, not the rifle. A well-handled MG42 could flood a lane with bullets so rapidly that the sound blurred into a single tearing note. On the Lafette tripod in a heavy roll, with optics and searchfire mechanisms, it was precise as well as terrifying. But that velocity had its demands. Barrel changes every few hundred rounds under heavy load, disciplined crews to rotate hot steel, and a constant appetite for belts that challenged even well-organized supply. American doctrine respected the storm but planned for the day after. A platoon leader wanted his base of fire element to be alive when the artillery smoke thinned and the rifle squads needed covering threads to cross a field. The M1919A4's air-cooled barrel punished haste. Too many long strings and accuracy would wander, metal would soften, and stoppages would chew time. Short bursts, 5 to 8 rounds by the rhythm many crews adopted, let the gun cool between pulses while keeping the beaten zone closed. The T&E let the gunner walk that zone across a hedgerow gap, then back again, barely a handwheel twitch each time. This wasn't a bloodless theory. In dusty training ranges from Camp Roberts to Fort Benning, instructors made students feel what heat did to a barrel, not with lectures but with gloves that smelled of scorched dust and oil. The lesson took. A crew that squandered belts in a minute would have nothing left when the enemy chose the real moment. Fire control, not firepower, preserved the initiative. Leaders assigned sectors measured by fence posts, tree lines, and buildings. Range estimation drills were relentless, because a burst placed 10 meters short or high was not just waste, it was silence where a comrade needed sound. The Browning system had other advantages in the slow fight. Its mass and tripod stability made for predictable dispersion. The gun's talk, that steady mechanical clack, was readable even under stress. A platoon sergeant listening from a fold in the ground could tell if a crew was slipping into panic, dragging bursts too long, or firing blind. A quick hand signal, a shouted range correction, and the tempo would settle. Ammunition discipline was a form of leadership. In companies that had learned the hard way, belts were not thrown forward carelessly. They were logged, parceled, and brought up along routes that were scouted and marked, because nothing collapsed a defense faster than a silent gun on the critical lane. The contrast with the German approach was sharpest in how each army framed time. The MG42 could win seconds, devastating, vital seconds during the first shock of contact. The American M1919A4, used as taunt, aimed to win the next hour. When those seconds stretched into a morning, the habits forged in training, short bursts, deliberate traverse, measured elevation changes, kept crews in the fight. Between bursts, the gunner would feel the backplate against the shoulder, watch the shimmer of heat drift off the barrel, and sense the gun returning to zero as if it were part of his breath. The assistant gunner would shift a sandbag, nudge the belt, murmur round counts, and keep one ear for the platoon leader's whistle. Even the tools reinforced the philosophy. The T&E mechanism turned area denial into a repeatable craft. Data scratched in grease pencil on a tripod leg told a story of angles and ranges the way a map told terrain. A few mill turns left, 2 clicks elevation down, and the gun would be where it needed to be without guesswork. When visibility faltered, smoke, dust, drizzle, the habit of short bursts kept tracers from blinding the crew and let corrections be read in the fall of shot instead of guessed in a stream. By the time American units crossed into combat in North Africa and Italy, these ideas met weather, terrain, and an enemy who argued back with steel. The result was not a clean confirmation but a hard refinement, trial by dust, stone, and the impatient heat of Mediterranean afternoons, which is where the next layer of context begins. North Africa taught the first hard lesson. Sand finds everything. It rides the belt. It clings to feed trays and chews at links. In Tunisia, 1943, American machine gun crews discovered that long strings were not only wasteful, they were invitations to stoppages. Dust mixed with heat to thicken oil into paste. An overheated M1919 became forgiving only in theory. In practice, it punished impatience with sluggish return, light primer strikes, or ruptured cases that stole minutes from a fight. Short bursts, 5 to 8 rounds, a breath between, kept chambers cooler and gave assistants time to brush grit from the feedway without falling behind. The crews learned to fight a clock as much as an enemy. The rhythm of the bursts and the rhythm of maintenance became one. Italy added stone and slope. In the Liri Valley and the approaches to Cassino, American gunners set tripods in terraces and behind low walls slick with rain. Long lanes were rare. Sectors broke into compartments, a vineyard row, a road bend, a railway cut. Here the doctrine of the beaten zone mattered in meters, not hundreds. Leaders plotted sectors like chess squares. Fire control became intimate. The section sergeant could walk to a gun and place a palm on the receiver to feel heat instead of trusting eyes glazed by rain and fatigue. When the gun spoke in excess, too long, too bright with tracers, he cut it down with a gesture. Control returned. Ammunition was hauled up mule tracks and human chains. Belts arrived damp and mottled with mud. Short bursts preserved not just barrels but legs. The Germans were learning too. The MG42's quick change system was more than a technical feature. It was a drill stamped into muscle memory. In mountain fighting, German crews shielded their barrel changes behind boulders and walls, the number 2 man counting rounds the way an American assistant counted bursts. But the arithmetic diverged. A high cyclic rate consumed belts at a rate that forced choices: carry more ammunition and carry less of something else, accept fewer changes of position, commit to a fire plan, and hope the enemy tolerated your schedule. When contact stretched beyond plan, when an American attack stalled but did not break, the German tempo had to slow or starve. That is when the immovable, patient talk of Browning's began to tell. June 1944 brought the hedgerows. Normandy fought differently. Vision closed down to tunnels. Targets appeared as flickers through gaps in hawthorn and earth. The M1919A4 on a T&E became a surgeon. Gunners learned to stitch openings and gate cross lanes with measured pulses. A 6-round burst across a gap. Pause. A correction by a handwheel quarter turn. Another 6. The assistant gunner fed the belt high to prevent snagging on brush. A third man watched flanks with a carbine and kept count over the noise. Ammunition teams built caches behind tree stumps and marked them with scraps of cloth. When the German gun opened, often first, often with a roar, the American reply was not to match noise, but to starve it. Keep the gap closed. Punish any silhouette that tries to pass. Save enough for the counterattack that will need a corridor of sound later in the day. Survey data and manuals had preached this discipline for years, but Normandy made it instinct. Heat shimmered off barrels even in the shade. Water bottles touched, jackets hissed. Crews rotated gloves and rags. Some units tied a simple signal to fire economy. A raised fist from the section leader meant cadence only. A flat hand, cease. These signals worked because bursts gave space for thought. Between pulses, a crew could listen. To the note of the enemy gun, to the rifle squads calling ranges, to the crack of incoming that tells you if you're being walked upon. Long streams erased that hearing. Bursts preserved it. Then came the Hürtgen. Wet cold punishes differently. In the forest east of Aachen, fall 1944, crews fought damp, not dust. Oil thinned. Condensation crept into every crevice. Bursts again were insurance. They limited steam and fog that could bloom off a hot jacket and give away position. They bought seconds to wipe, to warm hands, to swap a belt without fumbling clips into needles of fur. The forest also amplified nerves. The MG42's tearing note bounced between trunks and seemed to be everywhere at once. American gun teams learned to resist the instinct to answer with everything. They answered with enough. Enough to fix, to blind, to guide a squad through a saddle of trees to the next cover. Enough to remain capable when the first push failed and the second was ordered. The .50 caliber Browning, the M2HB, carried the same rule into a heavier register. Vehicle mounts and fixed positions tempted long fire, especially against brick and timber where .50 ball and AP could chew holes. But barrel life, point of impact drift, and ammunition weight pulled leaders back to discipline. 2 to 5 round taps against apertures, measured rakes across suspected MG nests. Gunners logged adjustments on the receiver top with chalk so the next man could inherit both the gun and its memory. Crews that kept the big gun cool could hammer all afternoon. Those that tried to cut a house in half at once often found themselves with a smoking barrel and a dead lane right when a counter thrust arrived. Underneath these campaigns ran logistics. American supply was a strength, but not limitless at the squad scale. Roads are clogged. Weather grounded flights. A belt fired could not be replaced for hours. Platoon leaders learned to set burn rates. A rate for probing contact. A rate for a deliberate assault. A rate for crisis. Short bursts enforced those rates without the constant need for shouted correction. A well-drilled crew made an economy out of reflex. By winter 1944 to 45, the habit had become an identity. American machine gun units that survived the year did so with a common vocabulary. Beaten zones, T&E clicks, round counts per burst, barrel checks by touch, belts stored away from mud, cover first, noise second. The German vocabulary remained powerful. Shock, speed, the scythe of the MG42, but it met the American answer of endurance again and again. In those meetings, time favored the crew that still had cool steel and full boxes when the day turned. All of this sets the stage for the human, tactical, and technological angles that define why short bursts were more than a quirk of training. They were a way to think under fire, a way to last, and a way to win the hours. And it is through those angles that the pattern becomes clear. A machine gun team is a small society under stress. Gunner, assistant gunner, ammunition bearers, each with a narrow task that keeps the whole alive. In battle, clarity shrinks to a rectangle of receiver steel and a hand wheel's travel. The gunner's cheek feels the receiver's heat. The right hand rests against the butterfly or spade grip. The left hovers near the T&E. The assistant sits close enough to smell scorched oil, glove on the belt, wrist straight to keep links feeding high and true. Between them runs a silent counting game. 6. Pause. 6. Correct. A murmured low, or a tap on the shoulder, does what shouting cannot. They are not fighting the enemy so much as the seconds between the enemy's choices. Short bursts are a human accommodation to fear and fatigue. Long strings chase panic and invite tunnel vision. Bursts create space to breathe, to listen, to reassess the lane. They spare the wrists and shoulders. They give the assistant time to brush grit from the feed, to relay the belt, to glance at the next ammo box and make a decision about rationing. Ammunition bearers move like blood through a body, staying low, choosing a crawl path, dragging boxes by loops. If the gun talks too long, bearers hurry. When they hurry, they are seen. Bursts slow the pulse of the position and protect everyone who feeds it. There is also morale. Crews that master cadence feel control in a place built to remove it. The gunner who can stop at 6 rounds is the gunner who can stop at 3 when concealment demands. That self-command threads outward to the platoon. Riflemen cross open cuts knowing the lane will be stitched, not sprayed. Leaders conserve orders because a crew that speaks in measured phrases has already answered the most important question. Can you last the hour? Infantry fights over lanes, real or implied. A hedgerow gap, a fold in ground, a street that funnels past a wall. The machine gun exists to close lanes on demand. Short bursts are the grammar for this closing. A burst is a sentence that says, "This path is watched. Try it and pay." The T&E turns that sentence into paragraphs. Left 20 miles, 6 rounds. Back to center. Up 2 clicks, 6 more. Each pulse adds another stitch to a net that the enemy begins to feel as shape, not just sound. Sustained, this net presses opponents to ground and holds them there while other arms, rifles, mortars, artillery, do finishing work. Bursts also manage signatures. A long stream draws a line back to the muzzle like a chalk mark. Measured pulses complicate enemy range estimation and spotting. Between bursts, a gun can shift a little, lower the silhouette, reset on sandbags, or align to a prearranged reference. Fence post, corner of a barn, notch in a tree line. With map and grease pencil, leaders assign sectors not simply as angles, but as priorities. Primary lane gets 2 bursts per minute, unless targets present. Secondary gets 1. Dead space gets tracer verification at set intervals. This discipline converts ammunition into time. A gun that fires in statements can cover multiple avenues with the same box, trading intensity for reach. The enemy's response reveals success. If their gun must scream to free movement, it is burning its future to rescue its present. If the riflemen hesitate at known gaps, the lane is closed. If their mortar smoke comes early, it is because they fear the thread you can keep spinning all morning. Tactical victory here is quiet and cumulative. The platoon that still has belts after the first exchange decides when to escalate and when to let silence do its work. Mechanisms set boundaries for behavior. The MG42's roller-locked speed created shock and demanded barrel changes. The M1919A4's air-cooled mass rewarded restraint. Neither was inherently better in a vacuum. Each asked for a style. Short bursts matched Browning's strengths. Heat was the first truth. In air-cooled guns, heat migrates through steel slowly. A burst deposits heat in a layer. A pause lets it wick outward. A long stream turns the bore into a kiln that invites throat erosion, wandering point of impact, and sluggish return. Bursts keep the jacket below the threshold where mirage blooms into a visible steam that gives away position. They also help the gun track better on the T&E, since recoil disturbances are short and recoverable. Dispersion patterns matter. A short pulse produces a compact ellipse suited to a hedgerow gap or window. Long streams stretch dispersion and waste rounds at the edges. Tripod stability and the T&E convert the gun from a roar into a surveying tool, capable of repetitive, nearly identical bursts laid across measured mills. Tracer, used sparingly inside those bursts, is a diagnostic tool rather than noise, confirming fall of shot without overwhelming the gunner's vision or broadcasting a constant dotted line. Ammunition logistics are technology's shadow. Belts are weight. Links are steel. Every extra box carried is a cost to mobility or endurance. Short-burst doctrine makes the weapon system, gun, tripod, crew, ammo, coherent. It aligns mechanical behavior with human capacity and supply reality. A Browning that fires in discipline becomes more than a mechanism. It becomes a clock that measures how long a platoon can assert control over ground. And from that clock, all other tactical choices take their time. The logic of people, lanes, and steel converges here, leading directly into how leaders command this cadence under pressure. Discipline begins with an order and survives because of habit. In American rifle companies, leaders translated doctrine into tempo. Platoon leaders set burn rates before contact. Explicit numbers tied to mission phases. Reconnaissance, fixing fire, assault cover, defense under counterattack. Section sergeants enforced it with signals and presence, a raised fist for cadence only, a slicing hand for cease, a pointed finger to shift the beaten zone by reference, fence post 2, gable apex, left hedgerow notch. Because bursts created pauses, leaders could intervene between pulses rather than shouting into the roar. Corrections landed, were absorbed, and reflected in the next 6 rounds. Leaders also treated ammunition as a maneuver asset. Boxes were staged in depth, not dumped at the tripod feet. Routes were marked, low ditches, backside of walls, gaps under wire, to keep ammo bearers alive. If a position was likely to become decisive, extra belts were pre-positioned by night with camouflage and reference marks scratched into bark. The rule was simple. A gun should not change the character of its fire because a runner tripped or because the nearest box was empty. Short bursts made that logistics geometry possible. They smoothed demand, making resupply predictable rather than crisis-driven. Finally, command discipline protected the crew's mind. Leaders forbade exhibition fire. They rewarded the gun team that kept to the plan under provocation. Snaps of incoming, a flash in a window, the instinct to hose. After-action talks were not about noise but about effects. Lanes closed, minutes held, crossings enabled. This emphasis made self-restraint a professional pride. The best crews measured themselves not by brass piles, but by how precisely they could reproduce a pattern of bursts across prearranged miles. On the minute, for the hour. That is how a doctrine becomes a reflex. The German machine gun was a phenomenon. The MG42's cyclic rate, around double that of the Browning, produced a shock that froze men to ground and shredded brush into confetti. In the offensive, that torrent opened paths for maneuver. In the defensive, it slapped assaults flat with seconds to spare. Barrel changes were a practiced ballet. Number 1 and Number 2 swapping hot steel with mitt and pouch. Fresh barrels staged like magazines. Ammunition discipline existed, but the system's promise invited expenditure. If fire could decide the first 30 seconds, why defer? Trade-offs emerged when the fight refused to end on schedule. A German crew that dominated the opening could find itself managing heat, juggling belts, and repositioning under the weight of its own appetite. Long strings compelled frequent changes of barrel and position, each a tiny window of vulnerability. Ammunition bearers moved farther and more often. Each movement risked loss. In broken terrain, hedgerows, Italian terraces, forest compartments, lanes of fire shortened. Shock still mattered, but so did endurance and micro-adjustments through cover. Against an American base of fire that spoke in bursts, German crews sometimes had to escalate just to maintain parity, burning through their comfortable margin until cadence, not velocity, defined the engagement. None of this made the MG42 less lethal. It remained the most feared sound on the Western Front, but fear does not refill belts. When hours replaced minutes, a different virtue rose. The American gun that conserved power could still enforce lanes when German crews were rotating positions, cooling barrels, or waiting on runners. In those interstices, those small absences created by the cost of speed, the measured voice of the Browning decided ground. War punishes the undisciplined impulse to reply in kind. The hardest thing for a gun team is to hear the ripping onset of a high-rate weapon and not answer with a flood. Short bursts are an act of nerve. They say, "We hear you, but we will not spend our future on your opening." That restraint radiates. Riflemen who see their gun steady down, fire, pause, and fire again in the same cadence feel a spine stiffen inside the chaos. The sound pattern becomes a promise. 6, silence, 6, that marks time for the platoon. People move on the rhythm of that promise. Controlled fire also shields the mind from exhaustion. Long strings become a blur. They erase the feedback loop that tells a gunner he is effective. Bursts preserve feedback. The fall of shot, the flinch of an enemy silhouette, the cessation of movement in a gap. Each pause gives the brain a breath to integrate information, correct the wheel, adjust elevation by a click. Over hours, that breath separates a crew that grows sharper from one that grows blind. The barrel's heat is only a visible symptom. The real overheating begins in attention and will. There is an ethics inside this, austere and unsentimental. Bursts spend only what can be justified. They accept that victory may sound smaller than fear. They exchange spectacle for persistence. A saved belt might mean a corridor of sound later when a wounded man must be dragged, when a counterattack must be covered, when a crossing must be forced under dusk. In that moment, economy earlier becomes mercy later. And this steady moral arithmetic leads us to the moments when the habit of short bursts turned from theory to decision. The pieces, leadership, enemy trade-offs, and the inner courage to wait now converge on the battlefield scenes where measured fire outlasted speed and altered outcomes. The turning points were not only maps and arrows. They were hours in which one sound kept going after another fell silent. Normandy offered the first clear proof. Mid-June through July 1944, contact along the hedgerows settled into a rhythm of ambush, push, stall. The German gun often opened first, the MG42 scything gaps with terrifying speed. But once the first exchange bled into a long morning, the crews that had trained themselves to speak in short bursts found they could still close lanes while others cooled steel or waited on belts. On the approaches to St. Lo in late June, rifle platoons moved field to field under the cover of Brownings that refused to panic. The T&E turned hedgerow gaps into coordinates. 6 rounds across the left lane. Pause. 6 across the right. A half turn back to center. The German answer surged in torrents, then a lull as the number 2 man worked the quick change. In the lull, American guns still had a voice. When a squad dashed to the next ditch, the covering cadence did not falter, because the belts had been rationed 1 pulse at a time. By the time Operation Cobra opened on 25 July, the habit of bursts was not a suggestion, it was muscle memory. In the dust and concussion after the air bombardment, crews that kept to discipline could thread suppressive lines through drifting smoke and shattered hedges as the assault broke out of the bocage web. Elsewhere, the same arithmetic played out. In the fight for Hill 192 east of St. Lo on 11th of July, American attacks pressed a position that had defied earlier attempts. The ground was a patchwork of folds and orchards with sightlines that punished haste. Machine gun sections that survived the day did so by refusing to see the trigger. When German guns escalated to rescue a threatened pocket, American Brownings answered with a measured net that held corridors shut while mortars registered and rifle teams edged forward by landmarks. Stump, fence post, barn corner. The hour-long sequences turned on simple facts. Whose belts were left, whose barrels still tracked true. Short bursts made those facts break the right way. Autumn brought proof of a different kind. In the Hürtgen forest, September through December 1944, the geometry of fire narrowed into trenches of fir and firmer mud. Visibility collapsed. Sound grew larger than sight. A long stream from any gun drew all eyes, and enemy mortars like iron drew a magnet. Bursts became camouflaged by sound. A crew could fire a statement, 5, 6, 8 rounds, then sink back into silence while relocating the muzzle, a handspan, refilling a tray, brushing needles from a feedway. German MG crews were formidable here too, their quick change drills practiced to cold perfection. But the price of speed rose sharply in this terrain. Every barrel change risked frost-stung fingers and a telltale wisp of steam. Every long stream called down shells into the grid of timber. The American answer relied on endurance. Tripods were sandbagged into roots. Grease pencil marks on legs and hand wheels let a gun find the same notch of tree line repeatedly without visible aiming corrections. Over a day of pressure, the weapons that refused to overheat kept lanes denied, while riflemen traded meters for minutes. Some of the clearest inflection moments came in defense. East of Aachen in October and again in November, German counterthrusts tried to pry open seams along ravines and fire breaks. The first minute favored the attacker's shock. The next 20 favored the defender who could still talk. American machine gun pits that husbanded belts could dominate the third and fourth engagements of the afternoon, when the enemy's ammunition runners had lengthened their routes and the tempo of barrel changes had begun to slip. A machine gun section that had fired in statements could switch sectors on order, center lane to right, right to left, without discovering, too late, that their boxes were empty. The ground they held at dusk often owed itself to the economy they practiced at noon. December made the lesson unmistakable. The Ardennes, 16 to 26 December 1944, began with shock. Fog, surprise, and mass carried German spearheads through gaps and thinly held fronts. In the chaos of the first days, delaying actions hinged on crews that could produce the sound of certainty on demand. Roadblocks at village edges and forest tracks were not walls. They were threads of fire tied between houses and tree trunks. The 30 caliber Brownings on T&E mounts, backed by the heavy 50s on vehicles and parapets, learned to sew those threads with just enough cartridges to fix an enemy column in doubt without emptying the chest. When German guns lashed out to clear a path, they spent belts at a rate set by their own urgency. When they paused to cool or reload, measured American guns were still present, still closing the necessary lane. On village fights from St. Vith to the outskirts of Bastogne, you could hear the difference. An MG42 would dominate a street for seconds so intense they felt longer, then flicker out as crews repositioned or swapped steel. In those windows, a Browning team that had kept cadence could rake a doorway, stitch a cross street, and let friendly elements cross behind the net. Armor movements depended on that sustained thread. A half-track needed 10 seconds to lurch from one cover to another. A Sherman needed 20 to get its nose around a corner and present hull down to a threat. Those seconds existed because somewhere a gunner and an assistant gunner were counting to 6, again and again, without panic, without waste. Even the act of withdrawal took courage measured in bursts. A platoon that had to fall back from a wood line near a draw could not afford an empty gun. The last teams to leave were the first to be overrun if their barrels were soft and their belts gone. Units that had drilled short-burst fire could run a stair-step retreat. One gun covers with 2 pulses. Another shifts the lane and answers. The first displaces. The third takes a cut at the far gap. All of it paced by the economy that keeps belts in reserve for the final crossing. German pressure remained ferocious, but in those minutes, velocity yielded to endurance. The side that could still decide which lane was closed at the critical second kept initiative even while stepping back. By late December, when skies cleared and artillery reasserted itself, the machine guns that had conserved power became anchors for counterattack. The crews whose hands had learned restraint could now afford aggression. 6 rounds across a known aperture became 10, then 15 as the plan demanded, because the belts were there and the barrels were still true. The reversal from surviving to shaping depended on what had been saved in the worst hour. The habit of short bursts had not been a luxury. It had been the bridge to the moment when combined arms could take over. The payoff of this discipline was not only survival, it was the freedom to integrate mortars, rifles and tanks into a pattern maintained by guns that were still ready when needed, an integration that defined the decisive phase of many engagements. The decisive payoff arrived when measured fire became a scaffold for everything else. Mortars first. Company 60 mm and Battalion 81 mm needed seconds to register, correct, and walk their patterns. Short bursts bought those seconds with precision, not spectacle. A gun stitched a hedgerow mouth, 6 rounds, then went quiet while the mortar team adjusted 1 bracketing round left, 1 right. Another 6 from the gun, confirming the lane was still sealed. Then the mortar smoke, thick and gray, unrolled like a curtain. Riflemen slid forward to the next lip. Without cadence at the base, that choreography unraveled. With it, the pieces locked. Artillery followed. Fire missions demanded calm on the net and a position that did not panic. A machine gun section firing in statements could keep an avenue closed without drowning corrections. Forward observers listened through the gaps between bursts, keyed their sets, and called in time-on-target strikes that punished the first meter of movement. The American way of war, radio, logistics, combined arms, needed a heartbeat steady enough to synchronize. The burst created that heartbeat. Armor integration proved the same truth in metal. Tanks were decisive but vulnerable when blind. In Bocage lanes, a Sherman's gun could not cover what it could not see. The Browning on a tripod, laid with a T&E, stitched the openings the tank could not engage. 6 rounds into a suspected aperture. Pause. 6 along the hedge corner. The tank edged its hull forward, Koch's MG probing, then back to cover. When enemy anti-tank teams sprinted for a flanking angle, the Browning's reserved belts paid out in pulses that cut the run short. The gun's restraint earlier made ferocity possible precisely where and when it counted now. Assault crossings exposed the logic in its rawest form. A stream, a road under view, a courtyard swept by an upper-story gun. Each demanded a corridor of sound that lasted exactly as long as men were exposed and not a second wasted. Crews that had hoarded strength could raise the rate of command, 8 to 10 round bursts, tighter cadence, a controlled thrum that drowned nerves and brought motion. When the last man reached the far wall and signaled with a clenched hand, the cadence fell back to the 6s. No empty boxes. No soft barrel fixed on the wrong angle. The crossing owed itself to all the earlier no's forced on the trigger. The Ardennes contained these scenes in scores. On the north shoulder, fights near Elsenborn. Machine gun sections that refused to squander belts made the ground a lattice. German assaults pressed hard with mortars and MGs, then faltered in the thin air left by their own expenditure. American guns, still cool, still supplied, could escalate at the crest of each attempt. The 6th, 7th, and 8th attacks of a cold afternoon met the same measured sentences. That sameness is what cracked momentum. Shock cannot climb a wall that does not blink. Urban fights added a vertical dimension. In the outskirts of towns from Stolberg to the approaches of Cologne, every window was a suspicion, every doorway a threat. To sweep them blind with long streams was to end up blind yourself. Barrel mirage, tracer dazzle, the fatigue of wrists and eyes. Short bursts turned buildings into a checklist. Third window left, 6. Balcony rail, 6. Alley mouth, 6. Between pulses a squad moved. Between statements, a leader corrected by fingertip reference on a map margin. When a German gun flared, pouring sheets across a street, American crews answered with an anchor. One clean lane held shut, while others maneuvered to flank the source. The reply was less loud but more durable. Within hours, that durability decided which side could keep making methods out of ruin. Defensive Knights wrote the argument in slow ink. Positions along a tree line or a road bend soaked in cold. Breath condensed. The enemy probed with 5-man teams, then 10, then a platoon with a gun tucked behind. Tracer condemned anyone who leaned on it without need. Crews that rationed Tracer inside bursts, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, could see without advertising. When the probe thickened, the cadence tightened. Leaders counted with their watches. 4 pulses per minute on the primary gap, 2 on the secondary. A check round into the dead ground every 5 minutes. Hours later, the disposition held because the guns had not exhausted themselves on phantoms. Even withdrawals and relief in place turned on this logic. A line that must be held until 200 and then handed to a fresh company demands a fire plan that can survive to the minute. Cadence made the clock possible. Ammunition bearers paced their runs. Section sergeants checked boxes by touch. The gunner's handwheel marks guided the relief gun into the same pattern in the same seconds. The lane never opened. The clock never missed. That is what commanders meant when they praised steady fire. It sounded ordinary. It was not. German crews answered with courage and skill. Their quick-change ballet remained lethal. Their opening floods still tore men down. But the friction taxed them. In fights that resisted finishing, hedgerows, forest compartments, villages, their velocity strained under heat, ammo drag, and constant micro-repositioning. American guns meeting them with bursts did not cancel their power. They outlasted it. Moments arrived, tiny, decisive, when the enemy's torrent paused for a breath and the Browning still spoke. A rifle squad crossed a lane. A tank nose cleared a corner. AFO keyed a net. Each small victory compounded into a turning tide. By early 1945, the pattern was not theory, but a lived cadence across battalions. Fire plans assumed the base of fire would be there on the hour. Platoons trusted the guns to close lanes on order at dusk as surely as at dawn. In the last fights along the Ruhr and into the Rhine crossings, the American habit of short bursts wired the larger machine, artillery schedules, armor thrusts, bridging, for reliability under pressure. The advantage was not solely in steel or numbers. It lay in the calm decision, repeated 1,000 times a day, to fire the amount that the next hour would require. From these moments, the consequences flowed. Tactical results recorded in unit journals, changes in expenditure curves, and a quiet shift in training that stretched beyond 1945. The immediate aftermath shows how a style of fire became a signature of endurance. When the front stabilized and journals were written up, the pattern had numbers behind it. Ammunition tallies from rifle companies showed steep spikes in early contacts that flattened where machine gun sections enforced cadence. Boxes consumed per hour dropped to a predictable burn instead of surges and famine. Leaders could plan resupply against an arithmetic they trusted. In after-action notes, platoon leaders marked the difference. A section that stayed on short bursts could hold 2, sometimes 3, successive engagements on a single carry. The same ground, when hosed early, demanded emergency runs and left lanes silent at the worst time. Barrel records told a parallel story. Air-cooled 30-caliber tubes that were spared long strings tracked straighter for longer. Crews wrote fewer stoppages in their logs, and when stoppages came, they cleared within seconds because the gun was not fighting its own heat. Unit reports from the hedgerows and forest campaigns speak in a plain tone about this. Measured fire kept the weapon inside its design envelope. It was not a romantic lesson. It was mechanics and patience. Tactically, commanders noticed the persistence of lanes. Defensive positions that adopted strict fire control held through multiple probes without collapsing into silence. In villages, base of fire elements that rationed bursts could cover successive street crossings hour after hour, trading intensity for endurance as the fight thickened and thinned. In counterthrusts, common in the autumn and winter, this persistence proved decisive. A company that could still close a road and a field corner after 2 engagements could shape the third. It meant the difference between blunting a push at the seam and yielding a block to be retaken at higher cost. The effect reached beyond the gun pit. Mortar sections reported cleaner nets and faster corrections because the gaps between bursts left room for speech. Forward observers keyed microphones into quiet that existed by design, not accident. Armor units recorded fewer instances of blind moves under saturating friendly fire. Instead, they moved on the known rhythm of the guns, slipping past gates sewn shut for exactly as long as required. The machine gun, once a roar that filled the day, became a conductor's baton, visible because it was not constant. Logistics confirmed the wisdom. Company trains measured distance in belts, not kilometers. On poor roads and under weather, the load that could actually reach a forward platoon became the hard ceiling on tactical ambition. Where crews kept cadence, commanders could trade ammunition for time intelligently, husbanding boxes for a deliberate assault or a defensive night they knew was coming. Where crews did not, supply turned reactive. Runners sprinted, routes exposed themselves to observation, and the most precious asset, predictability, vanished. Training absorbed these lessons with a quiet shift of emphasis. The doctrine had always spoken about practical rates of fire and the care of the gun. Combat wrote those lines in thicker ink. Instructors pushed counting drills harder. Units practiced T&E corrections by reference points, not just by feel. Leaders rehearsed burn rate orders tied to phases of a mission and expected crews to translate them into cadence without supervision. Tracer was rationed inside bursts so that observation did not become advertisement. The why of short bursts, heat, dispersion, logistics, moved from margins of manuals into the center of habit. Psychologically, veterans carried an ethic home and into the next fights. They spoke about the machine gun in terms of hours, not minutes, of lanes owned, not noise made. The sound they trusted was not the saturating flood, but the measured sentence that meant a plan had a heartbeat. In debriefs and talks with replacements, the advice ran simple and hard. Count, correct, conserve, and you will still be here when the moment matters. Replacements who learned to hear the difference, who felt the discipline of 6-round phrases in their own hands, slotted into a culture that prized steadiness over spectacle. Opponents felt the change. Accounts from German units during the latter campaigns remark on American fire that persisted and returned after lulls, complicating movement and straining ammunition plans. This was not accidental. It was the audible signature of short-burst discipline operating across companies and battalions. The MG42's terrifying opening still existed. The difference was what remained when it paused. The American answer, still accurate and still supplied, closed the lane again and again. By war's end, the habit had become a quiet identity. American guns that talked in statements instead of screams, that measured their day in belts, saved for the second hour, then the third. From this identity flowed human consequences, who survived a crossing, who made it to dusk with rounds in the box, which crews could still answer when the last order of the afternoon came. Those consequences deepen in the personal and unit-level legacies that followed, reaching into post-war doctrine and the long echo of training. The thread now extends to the human cost and the enduring practices that shaped the final months and the years beyond. Across units that fought from hedgerow to riverline, the survivors agreed on something that rarely made headlines. Endurance is a tactic. The men who lived behind the guns carried that truth into the closing months of the war and into the classrooms that followed. In late winter 1945, as operations bent toward the Rhine, machine gun sections that had built their identity on cadence found themselves executing fire plans that assumed reliability by the hour. Bridging sites needed suppression windows repeated with metronomic exactness. Roadblocks demanded night-long denial of narrow approaches. Rear guards required a predictable cadence to step back in order. The short burst had become more than a technique. It was a contract with time. Company and battalion training cycles absorbed the lesson pragmatically. Counting drills, once a classroom exercise, were practiced under fatigue. After marches, in rain, with gloves. Because combat had proven that cadence must survive conditions, not just theory. Leaders codified burn tables tied to mission phases, translating doctrine into numbers a section could apply without new orders. Reconnaissance low, fix moderate, assault surge. Then back to low the moment the last man crossed. The T&E, sometimes neglected in pre-war haste, became the quiet star of the tripod. Crews were expected to record and reproduce handwheel values against known references so that a lane could be closed on command, even in smoke or dark. Instructors emphasized tracer discipline, one round guiding 3 or 4 within a short burst, not showers that invited counterfire or dazzled the gunner's eye. Supply officers and NCOs, too, built habits around the new normal. Ammunition carries were scheduled, not improvised. Caches were sighted in depth, marked by discrete cues that a night relief could recognize without map or light. The best sections learned to think in coverage hours per belt, calculating not only whether they could stop an enemy, but for how long and at what lanes. The arithmetic traveled upward. Commanders planning company actions could now structure assaults and defenses around a base of fire that would remain coherent under friction. It meant fewer emergency runs at bad moments, fewer exposed bearers, fewer guns going silent when the day bent hardest. The ethical undertone hardened. Veterans taught replacements that restraint was not caution, but courage turned into craft. Anyone could lean on a trigger when panic rose. A professional could stop at 6, adjust 2 clicks, and hold a lane for the hour. That ethic reached beyond the machine gun pit. Riflemen learned to listen for the measured voice of the Browning and move on its rhythm. Mortarmen keyed their corrections to the quiet between pulses. Forward observers and platoon leaders counted bursts as if they were seconds on a watch. A unit that functioned like this felt a different kind of confidence. Not that it could overwhelm the world with sound, but that it could still make precise promises after a long day. Opposing accounts quietly corroborated the effect. German reports late in the campaign describe American fire that remained constant in a way that complicated withdrawals and redeployments. Assaults that relied on the psychological valley after an opening barrage found the valley narrower when American guns resumed their measured denial within seconds. In close terrain, the last villages before the rivers, the woods that bracketed approaches, this persistence made the difference between a breach that widened and one that healed under methodical pressure. The legacy did not freeze in 1945. Post-war doctrine kept the core, practical rates over cyclic, heat management as a tactical variable, T&E mastery as a team's language. As weapons evolved, the lineage from the Browning families through post-war general-purpose guns, the logic of short bursts traveled with the steel. The details of the mechanism changed. The discipline did not. Infantry schools taught that suppression is a function of effect over time, not decibels per second. They taught that logistics lives in the gunner's finger and the assistants count as surely as in a truck's manifest. And they taught that the moral center of a crew's work is the promise to be effective at the critical moment, which requires saying no to 100 lesser impulses. At the human level, the aftermath looked like small mercies magnified. Crews that conserved early had belts for the ugly minutes. When a wounded man needed a corridor to be dragged, when dusk forced a final crossing, when a counterattack probed just as a company line was thin, survivability rose not by luck, but by 1,000 practice pauses. The same habit protects minds. Gunners who learned to make and keep a cadence were less likely to lose themselves to the blur that long strings induce. They ended days capable of correction, of hearing orders, of fighting the next hour with the same steadiness as the last. This is how a method becomes a memory, and a memory becomes an inheritance. The sound of short bursts, spare, exact, patient, outlasted the war's louder noises. It etched itself into training grounds and field orders, into the hands of men who counted under breath, and into the quiet pride of crews who could say, "We were there on the hour." From that inheritance, a larger reflection emerges, one that sits beyond calibers and models, in the way endurance shapes victory. The logic of that reflection is simple and hard. It begins with a gun cooling in a hedgerow lane and ends with a unit that trusts time as an ally. Endurance is not a spectacle. It is the quiet arithmetic that turns minutes into ground and ground into survival. In a war remembered for noise, the lesson that endured was a discipline of restraint. Short bursts were not a trick of marksmanship or a quirk of manuals. They were a way to make time an ally. They made cooling part of tactics, logistics part of gunnery, and patience part of courage. A crew that could stop at 6 owned more than a lane. It took the next hour. The ethic held because it answered realities that never change. Steel heats. Belts run out. Hands shake. Visibility lies. A flood of fire will always tempt the frightened and the proud. The answer that lasts is smaller and harder. Count, correct, breathe, repeat. Between those words lives the space where others move, where radios speak, where a plan finally locks. The gun is only an instrument. The music is in the cadence, and cadence is a moral choice made under pressure, again and again, until the habit becomes character. Listen to the wars that followed, and the logic remains. New medals, new mounts, new ranges, yet the measure of suppression is still effective over time. The best crews still think in coverage hours, not just rounds per minute. They still mark references, ration tracers, and make resupply a geometry instead of a gamble. They still treat the silence between bursts as part of the weapon system. Room for leaders, for mortars. For a man to cross 10 meters, he has to cross. This is not nostalgia. It is continuity, and beneath it runs a human mercy. A saved belt is a spared runner. A cooler barrel is a steadier hand. A measured lane is a promise kept for the last man across. The choice to speak in short, exact phrases returns as safety when daylight thins and orders grow thin with it. Victory here is not thunder. It is presence. It is being able to say, at dusk, that the gun still tracks true, and the team still has the power to decide. In the hedgerow lane where we began, heat still shimmers above steel. The wheel still turns a few miles. 6 rounds stitch a gap, and the pause holds the shape of the next move. The loudest weapon does not win this hour. The weapon that endures does, and the discipline behind its quiet is the part that history keeps.